Hi, I'm Danielle Chason, and I'm honored to be able to talk to you today about the Americans with Disabilities Act of 2008. The history of the original Americans with Disabilities Act was that it was signed on July 26, 1990 by President George Bush, who stated, "Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down." Even though this law appeared to be full of promises, which provided accessibility, equal employment, and educational opportunity for individuals with disability, this law was also vague and contradictory. Prior to this act, the United States had never had an explicit disability policy. In the 1970s came the disability advocacy movement as veterans began to return from the war and were considered disabled. The major components of the first ADA Act comprised of Title I, Title II, and Title III. The Title I encompasses protection of employment in order to eliminate the discrimination of employment based on disability and also to provide equal opportunity for employment. Challenges have arose in court regarding the language of this title and what constitutes, quote, an undue hardship in the workplace. The Title II component guarantees no discrimination due to disability within all government services and programs. This also includes accessible transportation. And finally, Title III guarantees rights for health services. However, after complications to this original ambiguity of the wording for the statute, President George Bush signed the ADA Amendments Act of 2008 on September 25, 2008. Factors that shaped this was that this law was shaped by disability activists who became frustrated by the ambiguity of the way ADA was written. Given the constraints in the judicial courts arising from these cases, along with increased negative media portrayal of the high-profile cases, Congress acted upon this by creating the Americans with Disabilities Act in 2008, Amendment Act. Some of these high-profile cases, which were influential in shaping and modifying the new amendment, include the U.S. Supreme Court cases referred to as the Sutton Trilogy. These cases include the following: Sutton v. United Airlines, Murphy v. United Parcel Services, and Albertsons, Inc. v. Kirkenberg. Following these three cases, the Supreme Court ruled that mitigating or corrective measures must be taken into account in order to determine whether an individual is protected under ADA. So an example of this is whether hearing aids or contacts corrects this impairment. The amendment to the ADA also clarified that this does not provide accommodations where it could be substantially limiting if corrective measures were not used. This caused increased judicial and legal ramifications in court, which emphasized the need to redefine the original amendment. The amendment to the ADA was influential in determining the criteria as to whether an individual with disability has an individual disability, restricting and narrowing that eligibility criteria. So the terms substantially limits and significantly restricted were also redefined in this amendment. Factors that facilitated its enactment and implementation were that proponents of the ADA Amendment Act state that implementation of this act still fails to fully capture the individuals who are intended to be protected under this amendment. This act only protects individuals with disabilities who are able to perform the job functions in order for the employer to hire them, keeping with the original employment criteria to remain consistent with their individual workplaces. Individuals who are looking to be protected under this law must be qualified under all other circumstances apart from their disability. So factors that facilitated the enactment of this ADA amendment was on behalf of Congress efforts and Supreme Court rulings to include a clearer definition and the interpretation of what exactly constitutes a disability. Amendments were made to this act to include these further clarifications to what were substantial limitations to major life activities. And while becoming less ambiguous in the wording of this act, this also in turn narrowed the definition for who qualified under this ADA amendment. An explanation for the disability and values about the explanation for the disability implicit in this policy were that it's a explicit definition of the original policy of the ADA Act is that, and quote, an individual is considered to have a disability if he or she has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of the major life activities, B, has a record of such impairment, C is regarded as having such an impairment. This caused some ambiguity and vagueness in the court of law, where individuals were allocating a lot of time in court arguing the definition of disability rather than arguing for their rights altogether. These values have been incorporated into the amendment's newer definition in order to more explicitly define this disability. So the current definition for impairment, modified under the amendment of 2008, states that, quote, an impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, a record of such an impairment, or being regarded as having an impairment. Explicit also in this amended policy also includes two lists which address what is meant by major life activities. It also includes a paragraph to discuss what is meant by regarded as having such an impairment, and 3 clarifications to the definitions to disability, which clarifies also that an impairment which is in remission is still a disability if it substantially limits a major life activity when it's active. So that's like the example of epilepsy, which doesn't happen all the time, but when it does, it has certain ramifications. So this amendment also prohibits mitigating factors to be considered in assessing disability. Implicit in this policy provides, previous to the amendment, was the subjectivity of the language. Terms such as substantially limits, regarded as, major life activities were revised to further clarify and narrow the definition within the Americans with Disabilities Amendments Act. After this amendment, time in court should be substantially limited to establishing whether a disability exists or not, because this amendment is now less ambiguous. The implicit or explicit ethical model that shaped this statute is that the implicit ethical model, it should be agent-based approaches to ethics, which shapes the ADA amendment statute, because this ethical model gives significance to the character of the person performing the action rather than the action itself. The ADA amendment states that individuals who are qualified for a job for all of their qualifications separate from their disability should be considered for their job based on their character in these qualifications. The intended and unintended consequences of this policy is that ADA was originally intended to provide protection for 43 million Americans living with disability. However, according to the interpretation of words by the Supreme Court, this has limited the scope of the coverage to 13.5 million Americans living with disabilities. Due to the implications of the Sutton Trilogy court hearings, the following interpretations have also been provided for the Amendment Act of 2008 to ADA. Employees who can function normally within their impairments are treated and accommodated for don't qualify for services under the ADA. A person cannot be potentially or hypothetically limited in their ability to work in the event that the treatment measures to their impairment are not accommodated for. These Supreme Court outcomes have caused an unintended consequence where some individuals may be considered to be too disabled to be hired, but not qualifying under ADA to be disabled enough to sue an employer in a court of law. This leaves some individuals with disabilities, yet again, unemployed despite the original intention and creation of the Americans with Disabilities Acts and amendments in the first place. However, further unintended consequences of this act, as a result of clarifying this language, is that it requires a disability to be present for at least 6 months before it is covered by the ADA Amendments Act. This may present a substantial financial hardship for individuals who have acquired disabilities that will be present throughout the course of their life. So, for example, if a man becomes paraplegic and suffers from a traumatic severe injury from a motor vehicle accident, he is not able to claim benefits under ADA due to the result of potential recovery of functioning for up to 6 months. So reasons why this issue is addressed by disability explicit policy is that this amendment to ADA was addressed by disability explicit policy in order to more explicitly and clearly define the definition and inclusion criteria of disability. This issue was also addressed to explicitly outline with detail the intention of the original words through charts and paragraphs of data. So Gilson and DePoy in 2010 state that, quote, within disability explicit and some embedded policy, 2 major lexical divisions exist. Policies that guide the provision of disability services and resources, and others which purport to protect and advance the civil rights of populations which are considered or identity as legitimately disabled. So this example explicitly states that ADA and the ADA Amendments Act are examples of this disability explicit policy.